we go. Okay. Hello, people. We've all survived 2024 somehow into 2025, and we're going to keep surviving on and on. This is Dan Whitman, time marker. It's January 13th, 2025. We'll need to know that when this becomes part of a time capsule. We're really, really honored to have Ambassador Ronald Newman with us today. And I know that everybody remembers Jack Kulik. Jack and the Ambassador Newman, I don't know the circumstances, but you are colleagues and friends. I hope it was all clean and ethical, the way you knew each other. Since I'll probably forget, we are going to meet Mondays. We're going to use this platform, not the other. I'm still admitting people. Here we go. As I predicted, people are coming in. Next Monday, apparently something's happening. What can you remind me, Ambassador? Is something happening in Washington next Monday?
Well, we'll get a new president sworn in now.
Oh yes, the new president. Okay. We are going to have a session. There are a couple of plans that might work. At very least, you get me talking about George F. Kennan, okay? But I may be able to do better than that. And I won't reveal more at this time. But we're going to meet. We've gone into our winter and spring schedule now, which means no pressure, no academic pressure. I will suggest readings and such, but I won't require them. We're not in a certificate mode now. We're just meeting as friends and continuing. I think they were wonderful discussions in the fall. Just some examples coming up. I hope my two American colleagues are impressed that I've got Marvin Kalb for January 27th. Amazing, amazing. James Nixie of the Chatham House in London, February 3rd. I'm hoping to get Tony Wayne. I know Ambassador Newman knows him. And so forth. So, and a young American that you don't know, Andrew Long Higgins, he took a course, he was studying in a course that I was teaching some years ago. He's now working for a church. He lives in Ohio, and his church is very active in crisis management. And I thought, how interesting to have somebody talk to us about the role of churches in crisis management. I remind Ambassador Newman these are discussions about international crisis management. And in fact, we have no particular agenda for this series. Now, Ambassador Newman is one of the most highly respected and liked diplomats in the Washington. It's very rare to find an individual who is both highly respected and very liked by everybody. He's nodding, but Jack Kulik is manifestation of that popularity. He's a wonderful colleague, and I was reviewing your bio, Ambassador, and I noticed that your first assignment was Senegal. We have a number of Africans on this call. You just heard from Daniel Uma, who's on his way to Goma. Can anybody imagine a posting more challenging than that one? It's also interesting to me, when you were ambassador in Afghanistan, you're remembered largely as ambassador to Afghanistan, but you were also in Bahrain and Algeria in opposite order, I think. Now, very interestingly, in Afghanistan, you followed Zalmay Khalilzad, a fascinating and controversial character. I don't know if you'll be able to comment about this very larger than life character. He was I think, a personal friend of President Bush, and you were in Afghanistan at a very challenging time. So, Ambassador Ronald Newman, you are the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, which is, I would say, the most elite group in the United States on including diplomats. You have to be an ambassador or a former ambassador, even to be a member of AAD. You have been its president for over 10
A
years.
long time.
Yes. Why don't we start, Ambassador, with what is AAD? We know that when AAD makes a recommendation about personnel or reorganization, we know that the bureaucracy listens to you. There are a lot of groups trying to say, we think you should do this and we think you should do that. When AAD does that, they listen. So tell us a bit, what is AAD? Where did it come from and what is it?
Well, thank you,
Yeah.
Dan. There
Yeah.
was, that was a very nice introduction. It reminds me a little of years ago. Well, let me just close my door for a second. Make
Sure,
sure.
that's fine.
Uh,
That's fine. Um, and I'm glad to see names that I don't recognize. That means we have some new people here. This is great. Uh, um, oh, and Victor Logonzo is with us. We have a Zoom user. We don't know who that is, but you're all very welcome. Here come three more. Okay, Ambassador.
Apologies, I should have remembered to close the door before we started. Well,
Uh,
thank you for that very nice introduction. It does remind me a little bit years ago when Amr Moussa, the then foreign minister of Egypt, came to town, and the Egyptian American community did a splendid dinner for him, and the introduction was really very, very full. And when Amr Moussa got up to speak, he said, he said, in that introduction, there was some exaggeration, not more than is acceptable.
Okay.
Uh,
Sorry, I break in. Becky Ndeto, our wonderful, inspired Kenyan participant, has brought new um, new people into this process as of today. Thank you, Becky, and very welcome to the new participants from Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda. This is great. I'll just add a Desmond Tutu story. When he used to be introduced with great praise, he would tell the story of the woman going to her husband's funeral and saying to her son, after hearing the eulogy, she said, we must be at the wrong funeral." That was a Desmond Tutu joke. He was a wonderful jokester. Um, Ambassador AAD.
okay, so the Academy of America, American Academy of Diplomacy, is a fairly unique organization. It is completely private. It has no government support. It is nonpartisan, does not take positions on political issues generally. It was formed with the purpose of improving American diplomacy. It was formed a little over 40 years ago by people like Henry Kissinger, Ellsworth Bunker, very distinguished small group. And it was deliberately elite from the beginning, although I like to say that it's elite but not elitist, which is an attitude that I hope we avoid. But it's changed a little over the 40 some odd years it's been in existence. But members have to be nominated by a member and then voted on, and we never elect everybody on the ballot so that we actually make the election somewhat meaningful. And we now have, even after 40 years, we only take in about 20, 25 a year. And so we're only a little less than 400 members, but many of them are people with very distinguished diplomatic backgrounds. It's basically an organization of people who have practiced diplomacy, working with foreigners to achieve diplomatic objectives. So it's not a policy think tank.
Mhm.
And it's deliberately nonpartisan. We have most former secretaries of state have agreed to be honorary members. Members have to be out of government to be elected, but then many of them get called back into government and we freeze their membership, and I can't make them pay their dues until they come back out of government. So to give you an example of the membership in the now about to go out by administration of only a few days left, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the head of the CIA, and the National Security Advisor are all Academy members.
Aha. So
You,
now you can charge them dues again. Is that
and
it?
now I can charge them
Yeah.
dues again.
Okay. Okay.
Um, then I don't know. We'll see if any Academy members end up in the incoming administration, but Some of members of the last Trump administration are Academy members. Robert O'Brien, who was the last national security advisor for President Trump before, is a member. And John Sullivan, who was Deputy
Oh,
Secretary of State,
yeah.
ambassador to Moscow. Anyway, we basically have two functions. One is talking to Americans about why diplomacy is important and why they should support it. That we have a number of lecture programs, various different things. And the other is talking to the State Department and Congress about where we think diplomacy could be better and where we are different from all other policy organizations that I know of is that when a university or a think tank has finished, published a study, then it's done with the project. In our case, we will sometimes go on and work with the Congress, the State Department to press for implementation of things we've done. For instance, several years ago, we took a position, a study, that American diplomats don't get out of our embassies enough in dangerous countries.
Yep.
But the job requires talking to everybody, talking to opposition people, talking to religious groups, talking to labor groups, whatever. And that mission needs to be accomplished, even if there is some risk. And so there's a piece of legislation. This is complicated inside Washington stuff called the Accountability Review Board. But we felt that that legislation had to be changed to encourage American diplomats to get out of embassy fortresses. And we spent 2 years with the Congress and we got the legislation rewritten. And now that has probably gone to our head because now we are working a great deal with the Congress to try to get them to put the legislation in place to create a diplomatic reserve corps.
Uh-huh.
And that is, we painstakingly got support from the last administration. Now we have to get support from this administration. But I know the incoming national security advisor is somebody I've known for a good many years. Uh, we know some of the people on the secretary staff, and I think we may get some buy-in, but we'll have to see. So that's what the academy is. It's quite small. Its members, most of its members, although retired, are active in one way or another, have other lives. The actual office is very small.
Um, we remember with mixed feelings after Benghazi, Secretary Kerry sent out an order, okay, no more risks. And this affected Afghanistan, your country, where some of uh, these civilian mixed military and civilian units were basically shut down. And there was a lot of agony, a lot of anguish about that. It's certainly not an easy dilemma. We don't want our diplomats in extreme danger, but I think you're implying that we have to accept some risk. John Kerry was not willing to do that, it was my understanding. No risk. It's not possible to have no risk.
If you want no risk, stay home. Uh,
That's
that that's not possible. And in fact, one of the things we say frequently is that we do not like the statement, which is made frequently, including by Secretary Blinken, that our highest priority is protecting our people. No, it is very important to protect our people, but our highest priority is carrying out our national duty.
we're
I
all
ask a
pondering it.
question, Ron?
Yeah.
Let's take a moment to ponder this. This is a very important point. The U.S. policy explicitly in the national security documents have always said protecting American citizens is the highest priority. Um, I know you're not exactly challenging that, Ambassador, but it's part of a mix, isn't it? Jack, your comment.
Yeah, well, protecting American citizens is job one, of course. That goes without saying, whether they're, sick or in jail or whatever. But then there's a question of protecting the people who are protecting the American citizens. And
Ah,
um, I mean, I was just thinking, Ron, of how you strike the balance. I mean, I closed down an embassy in Belgrade and I opened up an embassy in Sarajevo that, were in rather harrowing conditions.
Yeah.
And unlike some of my friends, I mean, I've been shot at in 4 different countries. Not me personally, but I've, been in areas that came under fire.
I
And
have.
and it's always hard. I'm just trying to wonder how you and your colleagues in AAD would try to find that place. Where is the balance between, between risk that is acceptable and risk that is not?
Now, of course, the starting point is that there is no permanent safe balance. Um,
Mhm.
but in any event, in any situation, the first question one has to get away from the is it safe or dangerous? Because as you both know, we've operated a lot of places that are gray. So the question is, how do you mitigate risk? And how much can you mitigate? How much can you reduce the risk? And how do you balance what you need to do with measures that reduce the risk? And so it's never a stop go decision.
Mhm.
It's a shading decision. Let me give you an example. When I was in Algeria, I had pushed very hard. I was there from 1994 to 1997. This was a very violent, bloody period in Algeria with a very violent internal uh, internal revolt and a blanket death threat against foreigners. I had pushed very hard to get foreign election observers in for a parliamentary election, including American election observers. And I had finally succeeded in getting the Americans to send election observers. So I felt that on the day of the election, it was important for me as the American ambassador to be out seeing some of the polling places. I couldn't, I thought it was not politically feasible either to, if anything happened, to say, well, I got them here and now those Americans are out and they're in the polling stations at some risk and I'm hiding in my embassy. So I need to be out and I need to be seen to be out because it's part of encouraging encouraging Algerians to vote. So I got my security team together and I said, look, I need to be seen to be in these 4 different polling districts over the course of the day on election. But it doesn't matter. There's no real reason that I have to be in one polling place or another within those districts. There's no particular reason that I have to be someplace at a particular time. So you go figure out how do I accomplish this goal with the best possible safety? And that means so the security team looks at things like, can you go in by one road and you don't have to come out by the same road? Uh, can you do a certain amount of surprise in your visits? And, are there roads that are more easily blocked than other roads? And things like, so they evaluate these things. And so in the end, I made all the moves, but I made them in ways which were as safe as we could make them. Every situation is different in how you how much you can mitigate risk. I simply think we are too cautious. I think in right now in today's situation in Ukraine, we are putting too many limits on the ability of our embassy to move around the country to support the Ukrainians. We were too fast to pull all our people out of Ukraine. I thought it was lamentable that we had to wait for Italy and
Sweden, I
other
think.
states to go back
Yeah.
before us to show us the way to minimum courage.
Yeah.
Uh, if we're going to support Ukraine, then we have to be on the ground, talk to people politically. And I know, by the way, that our ambassador there feels this very much. But the problem of getting out is not a cultural problem of American diplomats. It is a problem of American politicians being afraid of being blamed if something happens to the diplomats. And by the way, when I said protecting our people, I mean protecting our diplomats is not our highest priority.
Mhm.
Completing our mission is our highest priority. Protecting American citizens, that is, people who are not our employees, that is a very high priority.
Yeah.
and it always has to be.
Discuss, if you would, how did things change after Benghazi? Because that was a real milestone, and I think the paranoia went way up.
Yeah,
You had one diplomat and 3 security people killed, and President uh, Secretary Kerry, frankly, he really had like a breakdown of some sort. He changed everything. How do you remember the outcome of the Benghazi situation?
Okay, when Benghazi happened, you have to remember that Hillary Clinton had been Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton was going to be the presidential nominee of the Democratic Party. And so the hearing into Benghazi, what happened, was used by the Republicans very conveniently as a way to accuse Secretary Clinton of not having done her job properly and beating up on her politically. And they really worked her over practically with verbal clubs and all of her staff. The result of this was that it left politicians absolutely terrified that if something happened, they would be attacked politically the same way that Mrs. Clinton had been attacked. And this also created a bit of a problem in the Congress itself, because as time went on, and I had many discussions with people in the Congress, they came to realize that this had gone too far. But in many respects, they felt that they painted themselves into a corner, that they couldn't back down from this stance. That changed over time, because I can remember a few years after Benghazi discussing this issue with some congressional staff who said, we just can't change. I mean, we realize you're right. We're too restrictive, but politically, we can't get away from it. By the time that the Academy came back to the issue uh, about 3.5, 4 years ago, that climate had begun to ease. And so we ended up getting bipartisan support for a change in the legislation. But beyond the legislation, this is not going to change very much until political leaders, the Secretary of State, the President of the United States, are willing to accept the responsibility for taking risk, even if it means occasionally that an American diplomat may get killed or hurt. And that doesn't mean American diplomats are not soldiers, they're not going into battle, but there are things they need to do. And they need to make the best decisions they can, take the best actions they can to mitigate risk. But sometimes you're going to be unlucky. I mean, I've been an infantry officer in Vietnam, so I've been very much shot at in a war, and then I've been ambassador in Algeria during the period I talked about. I spent 16 months in Iraq, and then almost 2 years in Afghanistan. So, I don't make light of risks, and I've had friends who were killed and injured, but there are things we have a job to do. We have to do it.
That's a profound concept. A country that you care very much about, Afghanistan, um, exactly what you're talking about, Ambassador, very severely limited what civilians at the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan were permitted to do. And a number of the provincial teams were simply shut down in the middle of a budget year. You must have been disturbed, annoyed, saddened by that. Do you remember what a reaction?
All of the above. Now, remember, by the time that happened, I was retired.
Yes, I know.
We were not under the same constraints. I went, no, I had a lot of security. Let's not, let's be serious. I'm not taking great risks. Uh, but I traveled at least once a week to a different part of Afghanistan. I was in 26 provinces by the time I had been in 26 provinces by the time I left, some of them many times. I kept going back to Afghanistan as a private citizen because I kept writing about it. And I was able to, as a private citizen, I could move around. I would get the Afghan government to give me some security to move me around, and our embassy was very cooperative about often putting me up and helping me with my schedule. But so I still moved around. But it was very clear that I had much greater freedom of movement than the embassy did. I was back in Kabul. My last visit was about 6 weeks before the collapse. And I think I saw some 30 or 40 different people and was all over the place.
Well, that's great. I have other questions, but now that we're on Afghanistan, Ambassador, you've been quoted as saying, "You cannot say we failed when we never truly made an attempt." And you said that. Can you explain to us? I know you're disappointed about the failure of the U.S. government to provide the resources that would have been necessary. God knows if we could have afforded it, but we didn't do it. Can you comment on the time you spent in Afghanistan? U.S. policy was all across the board. It was favorable, it was cowardly, it was effective, it was ineffective. How do you remember the time when you were actually ambassador? And what sort of support or lack of support do you think you were getting from Washington?
Remember, memory is fallible, but looking only at my own time, this was a time which seemed to have great possibilities.
Mhm.
We were short on resources. Remember, I had asked for a $600 million additional economic budget for 2006, and at the end, I got only 43 million of the 600
Oh my gosh.
because Iraq was taking everything else. It was a period where there was a lot was beginning. At the end of the period, and in a book that I published a couple of years later in 2009, I made the point that we were not losing yet, but that we had no margin for surprise in a country which is famous for producing surprises, and that we could be losing in a year. And so there was, having said all those things, I think there are a couple of things that are important for people to understand about Afghanistan. First of all, America did not invade Afghanistan to make it into a democracy. America invaded Afghanistan essentially for revenge after the attack in New York that killed 3,000 people. And when the Taliban refused to give up Al Qaeda, America invaded with neighbors, with colleagues from the NATO alliance, and we overthrew the government in order to go after Al Qaeda. From the very beginning, American policy was pushed to answer the question, now that we're here, how do we leave? And the answers were not very good. And I think it's important to note that we kept changing policy. We didn't have one policy in Afghanistan. We had 10 by my count. That's not rhetorical. We had 10 separate policies over the 20 years, which meant, of course, that Afghans were never quite sure what we were doing. But the underlying theme was we wanted a way to leave a fairly stable state and leave. And so forming some kind of democracy was the only thing anybody could come up with that didn't involve settling problems with guns. And we made some progress, didn't make others. You can have a long discussion of errors made by the Americans and made by the foreigners. I think you can have an equally long discussion about errors made by the Afghan political elite and by their own leadership, which simply failed to create a really comprehensive state. I mean, there was no Zelensky. There was no equivalent of the popular mobilization that you see in Ukraine today. It is not fair to say Afghans didn't fight, and they had more soldiers killed every year than we had in the last few years than we had in the entire operation. But there were a lot of failures on both sides. But on your question, looking back on my time, we were trying to work out a lot of things. I think we made progress on some, others less so, but we needed the realization that this was going to be a long-term business. And perhaps our biggest problem was that was never politically acceptable in Washington. It was always the pressure was always for short term. And this has been a problem in many American situations. Person who was quite famous in Vietnam, John Paul Vann, nobody remembers today, but he was the one who said in Vietnam, we don't have 12 years experience, we have 1 year's experience 12 times. And that was true whether it was 12 years or 15 years or 18 years in Afghanistan. We kept changing people and we had very, very limited historical consciousness.
You would have done otherwise, I'm sure. You were hampered to some degree by the politics and the policy, which kept, you say, changed 10 times. Hamid Karzai was famously difficult. The US government, in some occasions, even openly said, we cannot work with this guy. What is your memory of Hamid Karzai?
I got along pretty well with Hamid Karzai. We had our arguments, of course, which we tried to have in private. I'm still in touch with him. I still talk to him 3 or 4 times a year. He's still in Kabul. Um, I would say the relationship deteriorated after my time, partly because President Bush had a good relationship with Karzai. I mean, the Americans did things which hurt Karzai politically, but he trusted President Bush. I think he trusted me that we were not trying to undercut him.
Mm-hmm.
After that period, when the Obama team came in, there were many reasons that led President Karzai to believe we were deliberately undercutting him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he sought answers for that, which he found in conspiracy theories. I, this is way too long a subject for one lecture today. I did a paper, about 10,000 words, for the U.S. Institute of Peace, tracking Karzai's deteriorating relations with America, because since I kept going back to Afghanistan, I saw him virtually every year. And I had all my notes, so I could look back at my notes and I could chart my way through his movement from trusting America to saying, why is America trying to hurt me? To coming to the conclusion that we were deliberately trying to keep him weak because we wanted bases, which was not true. But it was his explanation for the way we behaved.
We've talked in this course a few times about Reinhold Niebuhr and his influence on President Obama, who said, expletive deleted, don't do stupid stuff. And Obama said on a number of occasions that Reinhold Niebuhr, the so-called realist theologian, whose message boiled down is don't overreach. And I think that became the trademark of the Obama approach. I don't know if you can even call it a policy. What more can you tell us about the different, how did the US policy change international policy from Bush to Obama? It was quite
Well,
different.
when Obama came in, he said reasonably enough that we needed more limited goals. And then he sought to find the limited goal.
Mhm.
The limited goal he came up with was destroying Al Qaeda.
Okay.
And so he said, we're basically that we are not going to invest in nation building.
Mhm.
Now, the problem with this is that there is no way of destroying absolutely a non-state actor which can regenerate.
Okay.
So you can't have a moment of victory and you're done. And so if you want to more or less degrade Al Qaeda and keep them down, then you need to have an Afghan army.
Mm-hmm.
Armies don't exist by themselves free floating, they're part of a state. So then you need to have a state. And then you need to strengthen the state to build the army. And then you're doing nation building or state building.
Ah,
And if you don't want to say it's state building, you've got yourself tied up in a kind of verbal pretzel where you can't get yourself out of this because, in fact, our budget for economic development and democracy and these things increased enormously under Obama.
yeah.
And it's perfectly logical if your goal is to build a state that can keep the violence down and let you go away. But then you have to say it. As soon as you said we're not doing nation building and you're increasing your budget for economic development and government reform and all these things, you're doing it. And so you've made yourself incoherent. And that was part of the problem with the Obama administration. The other part of the problem, which was both Obama and later on, beginning of Trump, is impatience. So
Ah,
they to do the kind of things we needed to do to have Afghanistan be the kind of place that could fight on its own, largely on its own with some financial help, it needed to be a very long project. And nobody ever wanted to hear that. And I think it's very important to look at some examples of states that have developed from being very broken, very corrupt. Korea. Korea was an extremely broken and largely corrupt and certainly inefficient economy at the end of the Korean War.
mm-hmm.
And it was 20, 30 years before it really began to take off economically. And it was longer than that before it overthrew military dictatorship and became a democracy. Taiwan was a kleptocratic, broken state, maker of cheap products after the Chiang Kai-shek government moved to Taiwan. And it was a good 30 years before it was really taking off. Same thing, you could even look at Greece, where we had American troops involved in the Greek Civil War, 1948. No, most people don't know that. But it was 1974 after the uh,
Mm-hmm.
overthrow of the colonels before you actually had a non-political justice system.
Right, right.
So now I'm not saying that if you had 30 years, you could guarantee that Afghanistan would have turned into a decent, prosperous democracy. I don't know that.
Yeah.
What I am saying is that where you have examples that this has been done, it has taken much longer, and that was when people were not trying to fight a war at the same time. So the idea that you could achieve the same things quickly, that was unrealistic. And that was a constant thread of American policy and one that I think hurt us.
I think all senior American diplomats have always felt that we're putting out fires. That's an expression we keep hearing all the time. We don't have the luxury or maybe the willpower to make strategic planning, without which you cannot succeed in a major endeavor. I have no wish to start a discussion on the Middle East, but in light of what you've just said about removing non-state actors, what would you say about Hamas and Hezbollah? Is it possible that these two groups, which are malicious, can be somehow mitigated? You've just suggested that they cannot be absolutely eliminated because they're not part of a state. Does that sound right?
I think that's true. Now, I don't want to pose as an expert on either place. I spent 22 years working in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, and avoiding the Levant. uh, deliberately, because that gets you into Arab-Israeli issues, and those are presidential politics, and I didn't want to play in that.
Right.
I don't think one could predict. I think, look, Hezbollah and Hamas each represent strong forces. They are both weakened now. Speaking at a very high level of generality, the question is kind of, how can you build a better political solution that gives some room for them to participate without coming back in control? If you try to build something that excludes them totally, you probably are going to overreach. It probably won't work. If they have too large a role, they may well sabotage anything you could do to build a more stable situation. In the case of Gaza, you have the problem. It's a totally destroyed place. You have had incredible savagery, beginning with the October 7 Hamas attack, killing civilians, holding hostages now for almost 2 years,
Right.
Refusing any of the minimum requirements of warfare in terms of talking about who your prisoners are and what their condition are, letting anybody see them. And on the other hand, you have this incredible savagery of the Israeli response, killing thousands and thousands of civilians and women and children. And this has become almost tribal warfare, in which one side thinks it's fine to kill anybody on the other side, and that is fairly normal in a tribal situation. That's only going to really end, if you have a much larger peace. Right now, I don't think you have the leadership for that in either place. But at some point, the Israelis have to stop the fighting, and they have to have a plan for the next day in Gaza.
Yeah.
And they don't have one. At least if they have, they're not willing to talk to anybody about it.
Yeah.
It is not credible that other Arab countries are going to just take the place over and run it. And anyway, let me stop here. There will need to be a plan which allows political room for Palestinians. There will need to be a plan which allows for real control of the security situation by somebody other than Israel. These are very hard things that will have to be talked about. Lebanon, Hezbollah is a completely different situation because of Lebanese internal politics, which are totally different. So I better just cut it off there.
Well, I didn't mean to open up this horrible, painful subject. I would say I'm glad and I understand why you avoided the Levant, but I'm very sorry that you did, because
I don't think it would be any better if I'd been there. Don't worry.
Your clear thinking could only have helped. And we know that while Lebanon finally elected a president last week, they have a parliament whose president is officially Hezbollah. This is crazy. Anyway, let me turn to a documentary. I'm sure you remember this. AAD produced a magnificent documentary 2 years ago with two of your colleagues. And the title of the documentary was Being an Ambassador in a Crisis. And you had two colleagues and yourself. You have to remember this because I think you sponsored it, I think. Plus, you were one of the three. Tell us, this is maybe unfair because it's 2 years ago, but I highly recommend this documentary to everybody on this call. I will try to send you the link. I've watched it several times. This is a fascinating account. It's very personal. It's very anecdotal of ambassadors, one to Russia, you in Afghanistan. There was Susan Page, was that the third one? In charge of diplomatic missions in the middle of a crisis. What do you remember of that discussion? And if nothing, what would you say? What would you say are the guiding principles that can help a CEO, an ambassador, a chief of mission, when the country around them is really in difficulty, you've established the highest goal is U.S. interest, not necessarily every life of every U.S. diplomat. What are some of the things you can go by? We want to talk about this at this time because soon Daniel Uma is going to be in Goma and he's going to have daily things to deal with. He won't have the luxury of thinking or reading. He'll have to just act. What are some of the things you need to keep in mind when you're in that sort of position?
Oh, that's a hard question.
I'm sorry.
No, it's not. It's a perfectly good question. I'm
Uh,
just trying to think where does you start because, every crisis has its own dynamic, its own speed. Uh, so it's very difficult to lay down any rules. I mean,
um,
there are certain things you can do as a leader. One is you cannot be flustered. Try not to show whether you're flustered or not.
uh,
That's terrible. The old saying was never let them see you sweat. It
yeah,
doesn't mean you can't have a towel in your back pocket. Uh,
yeah. Let me offer this. Prudence Bushnell, who was ambassador in Nairobi in 1998 when it was bombed, in her book, she says, take care of your people, the rest will take care of itself. Now, that's kind of simplistic. What would you say to Prudence
well,
Bushnell?
I mean, there's a basic truth to that. Whether the rest will take care of itself, that I'm not so sure of. Taking care of your people, that is essential. And what that means in any given situation will be different. One of the things is that it's extremely important to explain to your staff what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Ah,
If
okay.
people know what you're doing, then and they know why you're doing it, then they know how to make decisions themselves for the things that they're going to be doing. Um, it's so hard to talk about this in generalities.
Each crisis is different, right?
Each crisis is
Yeah.
different. You may have to send people out to rescue Americans in danger. Well, are going to have to make decisions on the fly about how much risk to take or not take to look for somebody. I mean, that's very different from the decisions you may be making in the whole mission. You may be dealing with Washington panic when they don't need to be panicked, or when you think they
Yeah.
don't need to be panicked. Um,
Well,
and
you've just implied that a chain of command is absolutely essential. You said explain as chief of mission, explain to your people what your intentions are, allow them some discretion of their tactical decisions, but you're making the strategic decisions, I think, in consultation with your country team. Is that the way you would recommend people?
you have to encourage people to argue with you. Now, how much time you've got to argue may depend on the crisis, but some crises are very fast moving and some are kind of slower burns. Uh, but I used to tell my own team, with no particular respect for crisis, that there's no end of people in Washington who will tell each other if they think we're stupid. So it would really help if you would argue with me out here before we do something. Uh,
Uh,
and you get if people feel that they are being consulted, then they think more about what they ought to be doing. If people, if you have leaders who want to make all the decisions, tell me your problems and I'll order give you orders, then
yeah.
people don't think the same way. Then they just come in and tell you what the problem is and wait for orders. But they may have better ideas than you do. Um, so it's first of all, it's very important to encourage people to discuss with you, argue with you. And then if you decide differently than what they proposed, it's important to explain why you make the decisions you make. Because I've found generally you may not get convince people you make the right decision, but if you explain to them why you've made it and what you're trying to do, you generally will hold their respect, even if they don't agree with the decision.
Mhm. Um, another good thing to ponder. I encourage anyone on this call to come in either in the chat or unmute yourself. I'm going to turn to Jack in a moment. But first, Ambassador, you've mentioned quite a few times the tension between the policymakers in Washington and the chief of mission out in the field. Do you have any general or anecdotal comments on this complex relationship? When we say Washington, we're not just saying president, we're saying Senate, Congress, State Department, NSC, lobbyists. I mean, Washington is a very complex entity, and chiefs of mission they don't like Washington generally because they're saying do this and maybe not explaining the context and the decision-making process, though we do have national security strategies that are taken out at length. But from your own experience, what was Washington to you? Was it a pain in the neck? Was it
Oh, Washington's fascinating. I mean, Bismarck said the two things you never want to let people see being made are policy and sausage because each is disgusting. And there's some truth in that. But I think one thing that's perhaps important for people who are not Americans to understand, it's probably important for Americans too, is how many different voices have power in Washington. And this is very different from many countries that are much more organized with either fewer political parties or the head of government is able to really command. This is a famous, it's kind of a joke, but it's true that when President Eisenhower was elected as president of the United States, Truman, who was the outgoing president, said, well, poor Eisenhower, he's been a general. And now he's going to say, now he's going to be president of the United States, and he's going to say, do this and do that, and nothing will happen. This is a problem of the American government speaks with many voices. This is very confusing to foreigners, often, sometimes confusing to Americans. There are power centers in Congress. Congress itself is power, but there are power centers within each body of Congress. There are conflicting views within administrations. If it's not enough to say, I wish they would do this differently if you're in the field. Activist ambassadors who want to have a hand in making policy will be constantly connected to Washington in various ways, more or less appropriate, and taking an active hand in creating the instructions they're going to get. They don't want to be just at the receiving end of instructions. They want to be making the policy. They want to be part of making the policy. If they think they can make it by themselves, then they're also cut off from reality and they will get in trouble. But if they think they can avoid it, then they should be happy with whatever comes out, which they won't be. So how you're involved is a matter of multiple contacts, of working phones, of all kinds of things. You have to realize that I've never seen a policy decision made because someone wrote a brilliant paper and everybody said, "Oh, let's turn right and go that way."
Well, maybe the long telegram, which we might discuss next Monday. We'll see about that.
Well, but that was a product that grew up over a period of time.
Yeah.
So the long telegram was putting into words things that had been discussed for a long time. And in some ways, it's almost a perfect example of the fact that policy often grows by consensus. And then when somebody puts out a paper, it's, oh, yes, everybody knows that. Let's do that.
Yes.
But it's not because they put out a paper that's radically different from where everybody is convinced they should be going.
I'm about to ask you about transitions, and we're getting to the end of our time. Transitions. We're about to have a major change. We have no idea what exactly will come of it. But before I ask you that question, to give you a moment to think about it, I remember asking an American former ambassador to Sierra Leone, a country that gets very little attention in Washington. And I said to him, who makes policy? And he said, I get up in the morning and I make policy, which was a funny comment and which implies that the more important your post, the less independent you will be. as a chief of mission, I think. And those on this call who are going to be diplomats in the future, you might keep that in mind. Sometimes people rotate. They just to refresh themselves, they will voluntarily go to a less important country where they really do make policy. Anyway, transition, Ambassador, and that'll be my last question. What happens and what should happen when
Okay,
yeah,
take a deep breath. There's a great deal of excitable stuff being written, some of which will be true. This transition is looking very, very different from the last Trump transition. The
yeah,
last transition when President Trump came in was absolute chaos, everybody falling over themselves. This transition is, first of all, it's very organized. You may not like the policies, but they're much more organized. In fact, they are nominating cabinet and senior officials at the fastest rate I can ever remember seeing. So they are far more efficient at this stage than any previous administration, Democratic or Republican, that I can remember. Now, the policies may be chaotic. We'll see. Secondly, it's useful to remember that not everything changed under the last Trump administration. There's a lot of sound and fury, which is President Trump's way. Sometimes it really means things are changing, and sometimes it's a bargaining tactic to push others to do more. So, he talked about the North American Free Trade Act, NAFTA, the worst policy ever done in a trade act. And then after a great deal of fussing,
yeah,
we got a new trade pact, the US, Canadian, Mexican agreement,
yeah,
which is better and which is not terribly different from what we had before.
right.
African policy remained pretty steady keel from Obama to Trump and now to Biden. There hasn't been huge differences there. There are other areas in which obviously there are huge differences, and because of Trump's style, huge differences in NATO. So there's huge question out there. Is he going to keep his support for Ukraine? I'm sure that's a question that's important to many people on this call. I don't know the answer to that. I don't want to just tell you things are going to be fine. I don't know that. But I do know that Trump does not want to be responsible for failure. So what he will do, who he will push, I have no idea. But he is not going to just set himself up for an easy failure. And one thing that's been very interesting in the negotiations in Lebanon, which led, you noticed, to finally getting a president elected, you had a Trump envoy cooperating very closely with the Biden administration's envoy. You're having very close cooperation between Michael Waltz, the incoming national security director, and Jake Sullivan, who's now in the same position. And I don't know if this means you'll have that same measure of cooperation going forward. I can't say that. All I can say is that it wasn't all changed last time. It won't all change this time. Which things will change, but we need to calm down. And let me give you one example. There's a lot of huffing and puffing in the New York Times and the Washington Post about Trump's comments on Greenland. How can this damn person be talking about buying this? Well, I talked to somebody who was very high in the previous Trump administration. Trump began to push Denmark at the end of his last presidency to put some of Denmark's defenses into Denmark's responsible for Greenland into defending Greenland. They basically wanted one of Denmark's 4 frigates to keep up a regular patrol, have some anti-aircraft and some infantry, enough force that you couldn't just walk in for free. And the Danes have not done this. I don't know whether they haven't done it because they think they don't need to or they don't want to be pushed or whatever, but they haven't done it. So the root of all this yelling is Trump's belief that Greenland is vulnerable, valuable, and needs to be defended. Now, the policy may be screwy as hell, and you can debate that. I'm not trying to say it's the right policy, still less that this is the right way to go about it. But the starting point ought to be to look back at what it is he's concerned about, which I don't find the mainstream media doing, and which is discernible. In fact, there was an article the other day by former NATO commander Admiral Stavridis, saying actually this, Greenland is important, should be protected. Trump's not all wet. So, if you're going to deal with what's going to be a very emotional period, Trump's going to say something different every day. Everybody's going to be excited. So it's just take a deep breath, try to figure out what's going on. Some of it will be crazy. Some of it will be highly objectionable. But it may not all be as
Mhm.
bad as you think. And,
Yeah.
if I'm wrong, well, then there'll be time for the disaster later.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would add to that, Watergate journalist Bob Woodward, who's done a biography of every president since Kennedy, says that without exception, every president that he's observed undergoes profound change in their later years. And all of them, without exception, focus on this notion of legacy, which implies, it's not guaranteed, that Trump will now not be the same Trump. He will be he doesn't want to be perceived as a loser, you've just said. He doesn't, I don't think he wants to be seen as losing Ukraine, so it could, I think, just to support what you're saying, Ambassador, um, I think we can expect different behavior. We don't know what
I
it'll
mean,
be.
I would be
Yeah.
nervous about where he will go on Ukraine, but I wouldn't be panicked yet. You could do that later.
Panic is always an option. Failure is not. Jack, I'm sure you have thoughts about all this, and I think we're going to wrap it up pretty soon. If anyone would like to chime in here, oh, here you go. Elena Fonova, do you think Musk has a decisive influence on Trump? And how could this turn out? I give Musk 4 months before he's gone. That's my comment. But
Yeah, I mean, this
uh,
is weird, but
uh,
first, I don't know the answer. Second, um, Trump doesn't like competition.
right.
Uh, and so the more Musk has a public persona as sort of almost equal, that's likely to bother him. But
Yeah.
we'll just have to.
I will go further. I'll say by the end of April, he's gone. I mean, uh, yeah,
Perfectly possible.
yeah. Um, I know Jack enough. I can see his brain cells whirling and spinning. Jack,
I don't know how we are on time, but I do have
we're
a question.
basically finished, but we're on borrowed time as we always are in life. Go ahead.
Just a question about technology and diplomacy. You've seen a lot of, I mean, over the course of your career, you've seen how technology has changed, from old cables and telegraphies to, emails and now social media. Um, about 10 years ago, I inspected our embassy in Pakistan, the entire mission, and we highlighted the work of a young woman who is a mid-20s, very dynamic, good with languages, and she was posted to our consulate in Peshawar, which is like a fort in the middle of enemy territory, the way it's protected. But she got out there through Zoom meetings with first with local NGOs, and then she actually started talking on a regular basis with the senior older gentlemen who were political leaders in the region who did not feel threatened by her because they were not in her immediate presence, and they could talk over the Zoom call, and they would open up to her more than they would because they'd be threatened by a young Western woman in their immediate presence. And it was a fascinating instance of how technology was used to further diplomacy in a positive way that no one had expected. And from your experience, as you've seen technology evolve, when it comes to embassy management, crisis management, outreach, the work that you're working with PRTs and such in Afghanistan. Where do you see this going? Are you seeing changes that might be even more dramatic in the future?
Thanks for that.
Oh, probably. I mean, it's a huge assist. I don't think it's a substitute. It, where you draw the line, that's going to be different. Now, in the case of Afghanistan, it's not impossible, but it is much easier to have that kind of relationship that you were talking about if you have been able to create the relationship in person. Then it's a lot easier to be on the telephone later asking somebody you know who knows you uh, about almost anything. Second thing is the limits on technology is people's suspicion of who may listen. So you never, when you're having a Zoom call with somebody or various teams, various video, you have no idea who else is in the room, quite apart from who else may be able to listen technologically. And this puts some real limits on what people will tell you in certain countries and situations. So it's a huge assistance. It should be used maximally, but it's not a substitute for building relationships personally.
I can say thank you, Ambassador, at this point. You see, there's a chat. I don't know if you want to take the question on China or maybe we'll get you again in the future.
Let me just, I, I am no China expert. I'm going to offer a thought, but it's one for other people to debate. And then I really do have to go because I have a day job here.
I know.
China is walking it's very interesting. China is being helpful to Russia. It's not getting involved in the war. It is probably enjoying the fact that, for years, Russia was the senior partner and China was the supported partner.
Yeah.
Russia sent arms to China for Vietnam. Now China is more and more becoming the senior partner. And they're doing it staying out of the war. Russia's going to end up this war. However, the war comes out, Russia's going to have a really damaged economy for a very long time. China's growing, continuing to grow, not as much as they wanted. So I think China will continue to play a strong role, but a very cautious one, in which they will, my guess, and I'm guessing, is they won't get much more deeply involved than they are now, but they won't press Russia very hard either. But they don't want a Russian collapse. I don't know where the Chinese are on this business of the North Koreans being involved in Russia. I doubt that makes the Chinese all that happy, but I don't really know that. And I think I should end on that point, which is probably true for a great many things. There's a lot of stuff we don't know, and one should be very careful about having conclusions about things you don't know. So I'm gonna say thank you.
Um,
And it's a
Jack
fun
is
conversation.
screaming. Jack is screaming in capital letters. Thank you very much.
You're
Ambassador
very
Newman,
kind.
you're a person of great wisdom and experience. You've shared that with us today. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been lots of fun. I hope behind all these screens, it's been somehow useful to people. Yeah.
I know it has. I know it has. Thank you and see you
And
again.
best to you, Dan and Jack. Good to see you again. You did some really good work for us way back.
Yeah, keep it up, Jack. Dziękujemy,
Okay.
which is thanks in Russian. Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.